One of the great scandals of Christian history is the split between East and West. Despite a common understanding regarding God's mediation through the sacraments, our approach to Scripture, being grounded in the theology of the patristic fathers, and our insistence that the leaders dress in outdated clothes with funny hats, the Catholic and Orthodox churches have been out of communion with one another for nearly 1,000 years. One obvious result of this split was seen this past weekend when Orthodox churches celebrated Easter a week after Catholics did. Because the Gregorian calendar came into existence after the split, Orthodox communities never adopted it. They also never adopted the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception, Mardi Gras, praying the Rosary, or St. Francis of Assisi, all of which developed after we split, which just blows my mind. How can you be a Christian and not revere St. Francis of Assisi as one of the holiest men to have ever lived? How can children grow up not knowing who he is, adults that have never heard of him? What a tragedy. Which got me thinking. Despite our differences, and there certainly are some big ones, I'm willing to bet that they had some holy people themselves over the past 1,000 years, inspiring figures that they teach their children, feasts that they couldn't imagine living without, that we have no idea about. Now that is a tragedy. To think that God might have inspired someone as remarkable as St. Francis, that God has been at work making the world holy, but we've been oblivious to it because it happened in the other church, well, that's just unacceptable to me. And so, with the help of one of my students who is an Orthodox Christian, I present to you 5 holy, inspiring saints of the Eastern Church that everyone should know about. We begin with Saint Nectarius of Aegina, which is probably not how you pronounce his name or any of the others I'm going to butcher throughout the way, but you know what? It's the act of discovery and it's the thought that counts, right? Born in a small village in Turkey in 1846, Anastasios Kafalas, as he was called then, fell in love with theology at a young age, desiring to be a teacher and a theologian. Unfortunately, he was born into poverty, meaning that his parents could not afford to send him to school. Luckily for all of us, this was not enough to stop him. At the age of 14, with nothing but a blessing from his parents and his faith, he set off for Constantinople to study. Even though barefoot and with ragged clothes, his spirits were never dashed. He cared little for worldly possessions. When he prayed, God provided for him, and this was all he needed. At the age of 30, he entered a monastery where he took the name Nectarius and was ordained a deacon. He continued his studies at the University of Athens, making a name for himself for his wisdom and piety, publishing many books and biblical commentaries. It was not long after that he was ordained a priest and then a bishop. But everything was not so successful for Nectarius. After only 1 year of being a bishop, many became jealous of him and false accusations were waged. He was swiftly removed without appeal and dismissed from his ministry. The holy man that he was, he did not cling to his power though, but spent the rest of his life teaching, preaching, and even founding a monastery of women in the island of Aegina, where he eventually retired. For Orthodox Christians, St. Nectarius is a sign of love and patience, trusting in God during difficult times and never losing faith. Next up, we've got St. Xenia of St. Petersburg. Sadly, little is known about Xenia's family or early life. We don't even know when she was born. 1719? 1730? Who knows? What we do know is that she married an army general who died suddenly at a party, leaving her a widow at the age of only 26. Xenia never recovered, but some might say that this was her greatest blessing. Believing that her earthly happiness was over at that point, she set her focus solely on the kingdom of heaven, giving away all earthly pleasures. She gave away everything she owned, including her house and all her clothing, and spent the next 45 years wandering the streets in poverty, wearing only rags and her husband's old military uniform. But this was not some depressed woman aimlessly walking to the grave. Not at all. She refused assistance because she was happy with the simplicity of her life. She visited the holy elders and ascetics of Russia for spiritual guidance over the years, ultimately returning to St. Petersburg to pray and care for the poor. Many began to notice that she was disinterested in the wealth of the world, spending her evenings praying outside the city and her days serving the poor. This attracted a lot of attention. People looked to her for advice, asked about prophecies, and felt blessed to be in her presence. After her death, so many people prayed at her grave, taking a bit of dirt with them, that it had to be replaced every year until a chapel was built. For Orthodox Christians, St. Xenia was one who never belonged to this world, living entirely for the world to come. Thankfully, not all saints lived long ago, as is seen in the 20th century saint, St. Paisios the Athonite. Born in 1924, St. Paisios is a man that was born after my grandfather and was still walking this earth 5 years after I was born. Born in a humble village of FRIAR in Cappadocia, Asia Minor, he seemed destined for holiness from the beginning. At his baptism, it was predicted that he would become a great monk one day. This ultimately proved to be true, but not without its trials. Just 1 week after his baptism, the Greeks were all driven out of the area by the Turks, forcing him and all his people on a 400-mile exodus. Coming of age in the 1940s, he also found himself witness to the horrors of World War II, even serving as a radio operator for the military. None of this would break his spirits, though, as he showed an interest in spiritual things even from a young age. When the war was over, he became a monk at Mount Athos, growing in holiness through asceticism, while also growing in popularity for his spiritual teachings. For many, he possessed worldly experience, able to communicate in language people could understand, while at the same time having contempt for materialism and modern worries. Known for his simple analogies, he used to say that love and humility are the frequency in which God works. To understand these things, he insisted, people must embrace sacrifice and struggles, resisting worldly happiness and comfort. These make people soft and distracted. For Orthodox Christians, St. Paisios shows that the modern person can be holy, offering a response to the many false hopes of our age. Returning now to Russia, we find St. Elizabeth of Moscow, a modern martyr. Not sure about the other ones, but I can almost guarantee I pronounced her name right. At first, her story sounds very similar to St. Xenia. She lived a comfortable life, her husband abruptly died, and so she devoted herself to a life of prayer and service. In this way, it seems like a carbon copy. Her circumstances, however, tell a very different story. Elizabeth was not just a comfortable woman, she was a princess who married a Grand Duke, the son of the emperor. Her husband's death did not cause her conversion, as this occurred many years prior, and only with great courage in the face of her family. And maybe most importantly, her husband did ultimately die young, when she was just 41, but it was not unexpectedly at a party. He was assassinated by bombing. Her life thereafter was devoted to serving the poor and in prayer, just like St. Xenia, but it was lived with a very different tone. Rather than seen as a lovable lunatic, she was a defiant missionary in her own country. She organized people to causes, presented a vision of a female diaconate devoted to prayer and service, and established many philanthropic institutions to make a big difference. Unfortunately, there was another revolution taking place in 1918 Russia that wanted nothing to do with her service and humility. The Bolsheviks exiled her 2 different times before she was violently murdered with many others in the royal class. It is said that her final act, after being thrown into a pit with grenades, was to sing Christian hymns while bandaging the prince with her handkerchief. Even in death, she sought to serve. For Orthodox Christians, she is a sign of strength amidst persecution and an image of holiness in service. And finally, we end with the oldest saint on our list, but the newest to Catholics, St. Gregory of Narek. Born in the year 950, Gregory was the son of a bishop, a statement that for us Catholics might evoke a sense of scandal, but for the Armenian Church was entirely normal and a source of pride. His father was a well-respected man, being the first to write a commentary on the Divine Liturgy. Gregory would soon follow in his father's footsteps, becoming a priest at the age of 25, joining a monastery, and spending much of his life teaching and writing commentaries himself. His masterpiece, often simply called Narek, is a mystical and poetic commentary on Lamentations and is widely considered to be a masterpiece of Christian spirituality and a foundational text of Armenian literature. The text is so essential to the Armenian Church that it is treated as if it were a second Bible, kept in many homes. His philosophy of life is a bit difficult to summarize, making it the topic of much debate in recent years. Some compare him to Augustine of Hippo, others the Sufi mystic Rumi. Even others see him as a precursor to the Protestant Revolution. What we can definitively say is that he was greatly influenced by Neoplatonism, wrote beautiful poetry, and invited his readers to a mystical experience of God through prayer. For Orthodox Christians, particularly the Armenian Church, he is a saint with eclectic thoughts, all leading to God, standing as one of the holiest men to ever live. Which is great news for Catholics, because he's actually venerated in our church now too. Throughout his papacy, St. John Paul II spoke highly of Gregory's writings, even including some of his prayers in the Pope's own works. In 2015, Pope Francis took this even further, actually declaring him a Doctor of the Church, becoming only the second Eastern saint to hold this distinction, and the only one not in communion with the Catholic Church while alive. Just last year, the Church added his feast as an optional memorial to the Roman calendar, meaning that on February 27th, we Catholics can remember him in our prayers, which is pretty awesome and hopefully a sign of things to come. Here is a man who was never Catholic, and yet someone we can recognize as holy and worthy of prayer, reminding us, hopefully, that the divisions we hold on earth are not held in heaven. There may be many churches in our world, but there is only one Christ who inspires and guides us all. As Catholics, we may not be able to remember Nectarius, Xenia, Paisios, or Elizabeth in our liturgies, a great scandal to the communion of the Church for sure, but we should be filled with hope by their stories. Despite our divisions, God continues to be at work. How wonderful it is that there are more saints that we've come to know, and that they're not limited to our church alone.